actually start. Okay, great. So welcome you all. It's good to see this group here. I'm going to, because we've got a lot of material and because there's a lot of it with the history, I'm going to be keeping myself on a much stricter time. So we'll do about 25 minutes and have about 5 minutes for questions. So as I said today at church, one of the things when I got here at St. Luke's that I noticed was the talk about the Elizabethan tradition. And it seems, as I've learned more, that there's that's a term used in other Anglo-Catholic circles. So one of the things that I wanted to look at with that, one of the things is we're studying the Eucharist, that I was hoping we could get a better sense of, is what's going on in the Elizabethan prayer book. And does that reflect an Anglo-Catholic understanding of the Eucharist specifically? But it's gonna take us a little bit to get to that particular point. So the Elizabethan prayer book being in 1559, we've got a lot of history that comes before that. So before we get kind of started in that history, I do want to say some things on the term Anglo-Catholic. I'm going to keep using that because that's the term that in the States, at least, we say it, and people have this image. You say Anglo-Catholic, people are like, oh, okay, I get that. And generally people seem to be right in what they're understanding there. But one thing I want to say about that is my personal preference sort of came from my time studying in England. And our siblings in Christ over there, they don't say Anglo-Catholic, they just say Catholic. And part of that's because you have to keep in mind Church of England is a state religion. But to get further at why they just say Catholic too, that word Catholic, particularly when we use it with a little c Catholic really means universal. So when we use that term, we're really talking about the universal church. So we hear that in the creed when we talk about one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. That's what we mean. It's a church that comes, that we've inherited the teachings, the tradition from the apostles, but it's also the universal church. So it's not just one denomination or another, it's the whole church. Now, Catholic too also refers to a focus on sacramental theology. It's really interesting with this because in the States, we often have our little divide in our groups in the Episcopal Church. Typically, you'll hear people refer to those groups as liberal and conservative. I don't like those terms personally. What you'll hear me use is expansionist and traditional. The reason for that is because people who fall into the quote unquote liberal camp are sometimes just as conservative / closed-minded as conservatives. So liberal literally means open-minded, and that's often not what you find with the label, in my experience at least. So expansionist really gets at there's something going on in how we look at scripture, there's something going on in our liturgy, and we want to expand, maybe doing something different with that. And also, I feel like all of us have things that we are expansionist about, and then we have things that we are maybe more traditional about. And traditional, I think, is a good term too, because then you get at the question of, okay, what tradition? So I think those terms are better than liberal and conservative. They tend to actually say what they're talking about, like with expansionist versus traditional. And there's a little, I think, less judgmental and using those terms too. So in the States, yeah, we typically talk about that as the divide, expansionist versus traditional. In England, you've got Catholics, those focused on the sacramental theology. And again, this is Church of England specifically. And then you've got evangelicals, who tend to focus more on how are we propagating the gospel? How are we evangelizing? And the really, really interesting thing is that in both of those camps, you have people that are expansionist or traditional in England. So it's kind of nice in that, these camps, there's a lot more of them because even in the camps themselves, there's little camps. So that's, and again, that's partly why Catholic is the term that's used in Church of England. Now, in America, when we use Catholic, we often are referring to the Roman Catholic Church, which is a denomination. But again, I think when we do that, we're taking away some of the sense of that Catholic is universal. And we're taking away our claim to that word Catholic too. So my preference in referring to Roman Catholicism is to do it either two ways, which I would say both of these are the correct way. Either talk about the Roman Catholic Church or Roman Catholicism, or just the Roman Church. That's a way that we can mark that denomination. And again, that's just because it's Catholic. It's not just the Roman Catholic Church. They're not the only ones that have the claim to it. So we should take our claim for that too. So that's just kind of my preamble for the first part of this class. So again, in talking about the Elizabethan tradition and talking about the Elizabethan prayer book, we have to understand all of the stuff that comes before it. And that starts with the medieval church. So there's a lot of interesting things with the medieval church. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about. I'm going to just kind of hit the highlights that's going to relate to what we're talking about, and specifically what led to the Reformation. So in the medieval church, you didn't have like the Book of Common Prayer. You had certain books that told you how to do a service, but there were a lot of variations and a lot of local variations. So there were a lot of different ways to celebrate the Eucharist. And because of that, there were also a lot of liturgical actions that came up that people would just do something. And then there would be this big thing, oh, okay, we've got to figure out how to rationalize what we're doing. We've got to figure out, what's the theology behind this action. So instead of kind of starting from an understanding and then developing actions based on that, there was a lot more of the opposite. Yeah, that we were, as the church, developing actions and then figuring out what they meant. I was trying to think of a good example of this in our day and age. And it's a little hard to pick an example because it doesn't quite get at what happened in the Middle Ages. So like a good one, like over the summer when we were doing music camp, there were a lot of great questions. And so I would explain a lot of things. And one thing was with the wine for communion, that we put water in it. And you may have even heard this, that the explanation for that is, well, because Jesus, when his blood came out, water came out with it too. That's not why we do that. We do that because back in the early church, wine was so strong that you needed water to be able to drink it and not and not be loopy afterwards. So that's like really where it comes from. And that's I think an interesting way of like understanding how these things developed. And so why do we do that today. It's in memory. It's in memory of what the early church did. I think like the best though thing I can think of that I've seen. I'm gonna have to put the mic down just for a little bit for this. But you'll see during the Holy Eucharist, when we call for the Holy Spirit to come down on the gifts, that I'll go like this. Other clergy will do the sign of the cross, but this kind of blessing is older, so that's why I default to that. I heard someone sometime say that the action itself is symbolic of the Holy Spirit coming down. No, like that's not it at all. That's just kind of an added thing. We do that because often as clergy, we're going from Aaron's position, the prayer position, which is just this. So going from this to this, and that's just the natural movement. And when we do that, it's similar. Because they're so close, it's an easy way to do it without necessarily touching. But for blessings, generally the sign of the cross is if there's something really big. So if I was like blessing this whole area here, which presumably our parish hall has already been blessed and consecrated and all that at some point. But if I were doing something like that here, generally the sign of the cross, particularly being on the inside, blessing a room. But for like the prayer shawls, when we do that during the week, during Sundays, with the prayer shawls, I'll touch them because that's again in our ancient understanding of blessing. You put your hand on what you're intending to bless. So that's kind of the closest that I can think of a liturgical action now that would have been like what we got in the Middle Ages. But it was just, it was insane. There's so many variations of prayers, of ways of doing things. And again, they have to be rationalized after the fact, after we started doing them. The other sacramental rites are a great example. In the early church, generally you have as sacraments, the two great sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. Sometimes confession gets thrown in there, the rite of reconciliation now. But in the Middle Ages, there's this obsession with the number 7. So that's how marriage ends up as one of the other sacramental rites. Is we got to have something else, because before then it's not included in that list of those kind of other sacramental rites. Of course, at the same time, there is certainly a sacramental nature to marriage. So we're not saying it shouldn't be included in that list, but why it? Why not others? Just they were trying to get something in there to get 7. Aside from all this kind of liturgical stuff going on, in the Middle Ages, we also have the clergy starts to be less well educated. And part of that has to do with the power of the church. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we get into Henry. But it really has more to do with things like the Black Plague. There just wasn't there wasn't the ability to have the same level of education. And so kind of with all this stuff going on, another thing we see is, as we've talked about before, clergy start celebrating the Eucharist on their own. That's where the I believe, as opposed to we believe, for the Nicene Creed comes from, because it's really weird saying we believe if it's just you there. And unfortunately, what that meant is Eucharist was not seen as a community, as a communal thing, the way it was before. And that's like literally the name communion means in common, that we're sharing something in common. You get that celebrating it solo. You get the concern with spilling wine, which goes back to what we talked about last week with transubstantiation. They're worried. This is the the blood of Christ. Oh my gosh, I don't want to spill this. You also get, Latin. Latin's not the vernacular language for a lot of people. Now certainly the thought is that at least some Latin would have been understood by everyone. I mean, think about, Spanish for us. Most of us, even if we don't know Spanish, know a phrase or two. So Latin may have been a little like that, but it was not the language understood by people. So what ended up happening is there's this focus on the solo act of the Eucharist, as there's a concern about actually sharing the Eucharist, and to kind of fill the space there. You get all these like secret prayers that the priest says to themselves at the altar. But what happens is Eucharist becomes more of a performance. So some people only come and stay until the elevation. Like that's like the big thing, the big performance. And there's even boards that they have with the pictures of the host and the chalice that they hold up and people will go to and kiss and all of that. And it's, the idea is that that's enough to communicate people, which is a real problem. So there's a lot of these problems in just how Eucharist is being celebrated. And that's one of the things the Reformation is coming in and attacking, is that there's all these issues with how the medieval church is doing things. So again, that leads us to the Reformation. And that, of course, leads us in England to King Henry VIII. So interesting thing in England, the title of the British monarchy is still Defender of the Faith. And irony of ironies, that was a title granted to the English crown by the Pope. And specifically, it was granted to Henry VIII for writing a treatise that basically spoke out against Martin Luther. So that's a kind of big irony, but it says where Henry VIII was in his own personal piety and his own theology. Like he didn't have a problem with the Roman Catholic Church in the way that the reformers did. His problem was very different. It was political. And part of that was an understanding. There was, I talk about this in the Middle Ages. There was this idea of these two swords. There's the sword of the state and there's the sword of the church. And that's where the power is, with the state and with the church. What we start seeing with the Reformation is nationalism and these countries taking this power back. We see it very much with Germany, but we see it with Henry too, because he has this sense that God has ordained him to be the King of England, that this divine right, that he has a divine right to rule. And so that leads us to the issue of an heir, that Henry VIII really wants a male heir. And his first wife, Catherine, there's a problem with getting a male heir. And part of it's whenever she is able to produce him a boy, the boy does not survive. So he's getting kind of upset about this. Of course, this is when Anne Boleyn comes in and all that. But the issue with his first wife, Catherine, so she actually had been married to Henry VIII's brother, the previous king. Now, they hadn't had any children. There's a whole story about this with Levi, but in the Old Testament, but that there wasn't, in early scripture, there wasn't seen a problem with marrying your brother's widow if there wasn't a child there. For us nowadays, kind of look at that and it's like, seems kind of icky. um, and there was enough of this in Henry VIII's day that he kind of used this. So his thing was, he said to the Pope, okay, I married my brother's wife. Clearly God has a problem with this because I don't have a male heir. So this marriage can't be legitimate. I need you to say it's illegitimate, to give me a divorce. So this normally wouldn't have been an issue, but there's a couple of political concerns involved. One is that Henry had actually gotten permission from the previous Pope to get married in the first place. But the real issue is that Catherine is the nephew of the Holy Roman Emperor, who is putting a lot of pressure on the Pope not to grant this divorce. In fact, like thinking back to looking back through some of my church history notes, I had a note there about the Pope even being under house arrest there. So the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't playing games here. So Catherine was pretty well connected. There were a lot of political issues here. So the Pope said no. Henry wasn't really happy about this, but fortunately for him, he needed a new Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas Cranmer happened to be around, who was friends with the Boleyn family too. And he was willing to allow for the divorce. So Henry claims that as ruler of England, he is also the head of the Church of England. And so he has the right to excommunicate the Pope over this, which he does, and gets excommunicated himself. So from this point on until Bloody Mary, which we'll get to later, England is a state religion. The Church of England is a state religion of England. And the monarch is considered head of the state as well as the church. So that gives, before I get into Thomas Cranmer, I do just want to make a note. I think there's something powerful about this, about there's a lot of people that try to skirt over the history and say like, well, like Church of England it wasn't all about the divorce, and it wasn't. But what happened with the English Reformation wasn't all about that. But that was a big part of it. And I think we need to be mindful of that and remember that. Because I think one of the things that comes out of that that's strong and powerful, we can't just make this claim that we're this big, perfect church that does everything right. Our origins show otherwise, because there's a lot that Henry VIII was doing that was wrong, and England itself, Bloody Mary gets on the throne because her mother Catherine. There was a lot of sympathy towards her in England. But yeah, so we can't stand on our own 2 feet and say that our denomination is perfect, but no denomination can do that. But if we can realize that for ourselves, if we can see that in our origins, that helps us with our humility, and it helps us ultimately see what the church is truly about: grace, that it's the grace that God gives us. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember with all of this too. So anyways, now getting to Thomas Cranmer. So one of the things that's fun for me thinking back on Kramner and reading more about him is his time in Cambridge. It's fun, and I think back to my short time in Cambridge and all of these different places, and I think, oh yeah, being there. At one point, somebody, I wish I could remember the name of the church. Somebody took me to this small little church in this little alleyway in Cambridge, where there's a plaque by the pulpit commemorating Kramner's preaching there. So while Kramner's in Cambridge, he was a part of this group that was hugely supportive of the Protestant Reformation. And they would talk about it, and they would talk about these Reformation ideas coming from the continent. And so when Kramner gets to this point of power and gets to this point where he's in this place of being able to provide Henry with what he wants with this divorce, he sees this as an opportunity to bring Protestant ideals to England. So, and as I talked about before, Henry VIII, his piety still remained very Catholic, but he was willing to allow a lot because Kramner ultimately supported him. But of course, Henry VIII didn't last forever, and his son, Edward VI, followed as ruler. And it's there we get 2 books of common prayer. And we'll be this is getting into what we'll be talking about soon, because next time we're going to be talking a little bit more about the structure for the Eucharist, and using that to lead into talking about these 2 prayer books under Kramner's time. So you've got 1549 and then 1552. So the important thing with this too is Kramner realized what he was facing. So before these prayer books, he had some rites that were part in Latin, but part in English, because it was important for him that people understand what's going on. But then with 1549, a lot of it's kind of more of a sort of Protestant, but still would have been familiar in form to the folks in England, with the Latin Mass, as much as that could be familiar to people worshiping. But then it's 1552 that Kramner starts making a lot of changes, really to emphasize some of the Protestant theology. So we're going to stop there for today. And like I said, we're going to be going next time. Our next few sessions will be looking at, next couple of sessions at least, we'll be looking at some of the forms that go into the common forms that go into Eucharist to understand the structure of the service. And we'll be going into these 2 prayer books after that. But I want to open up this time for questions. And those on Zoom, you can type in your questions, and I'll look over and answer any of those. And if you're watching this later, type one into the comment section for the video, and that way, if there's a big question, I can hopefully answer that in the next class too. But any questions you guys have?
I have a question. When you were saying that in England they use Catholic instead of Anglo-Catholic, is that a capital C or lowercase?
I would think, yeah. So in England, with the idea of Catholic, I would think it's still uppercase, because it's talking about a specific group based on the sacramental theology. But I was thinking of that, and I'd have to go back and look to make sure. But that would be my assumption there.
And they still use it today. They
Yeah.
still use the term Catholic
Yeah, that was a really so in England it's still Catholic as opposed to Anglo-Catholic. Yeah, that was a really interesting thing for me when I was over there. It was kind of like a little bit of a learning curve, but it was kind of, like I said, it was nice too, because it was claiming that title of Catholic for our own. So, yeah.
So where does C of E come in?
C of E, yeah, Church of England. Yeah, so when we refer to the Church in England, that we are in communion with, so where the Archbishop of Canterbury is kind of the chief bishop there, we call it Church of England because it is the Church of England. It's a state religion. So
but they use that over there too.
They use that over there too. Yeah, because that's their official title. Yeah. So when we refer to the Church of England, we're referring to essentially a denomination. Because this is an important point too, to make. We often talk about the Anglican Church as if there's just one Anglican Church. There's not. There's many Anglican churches, denominations, if you will, across the globe. It's just that we're in communion with each other. So that's the Anglican Communion. You could think of it as we're a bunch of different denominations that are in full communion with each other. So just as in the States, the Episcopal Church is in full communion with the Lutheran Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America specifically. So I could go over to a Lutheran church and serve there as their minister, just like a Lutheran minister could come and serve an Episcopal church. And I've known at least two that have. So it's the same thing with us. A Church of England clergy person could come here and serve. Just as if I went over to England, I could go over there and serve. And there wouldn't be, a huge hubbubaloo, or, I'd have to go and get some extra training or schooling or something. So, but another way to kind of understand that a little bit more too, with Scotland, when we refer to Church of Scotland, that's a Presbyterian church that's there. And we'll be talking about the Scots further down the road too, specifically the Episcopal Church in Scotland, because they are members of the Anglican Communion, but they're not the official church. They're not the official state church of Scotland. That's the Presbyterians. In Ireland, it would, of course, be the Roman Catholic Church you would be referring to if you said Church of Ireland. And some people do. I think that I'd have to look that up too. I don't know if that would be different from Northern Ireland, since they're still under the crown.
It would be more C of E,
Yeah.
I would think.
I would think so too. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, thinking back on my experience, that may be the case for Northern Ireland. Yeah, so that they would be an Anglican Communion church as opposed to a different church. So yeah.
That's interesting, because other churches in Europe have state churches also, mostly Lutheran.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I remember hearing about the church in Sweden. Maybe they do call it that. For example, I don't know if you know if they still have a national church in Sweden, for example.
Yeah, that I don't
A
know.
lot of those churches do.
Norway.
Church state and
Lutheran.
Interesting. Yeah, that I would, but
Just
yeah.
observation.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good, that kind of goes back, talking about with the Lutheran church in Germany also being a state religion. That's particularly important looking at the history too, because like I said, that's where you see the nationalism on the rise, is that the dukes, barons, the people in power in Germany, they start to support Luther, and supporting Luther for them isn't just about the Reformation, although hopefully, presumably it is, but it's also about their own power, because they have more power now, not like currently now, because we're not in a feudal system anymore, but for most of the world. But but in that time with feudalism, with that sort of power not being connected to Rome, it's a big thing. Like you had your own ability to make your own choices as a ruler, just by getting rid of them as a church. So again, that's not to say that that's the only reason for the Reformation, because all the reformers really did have deeply held beliefs about how church should be. But at the same time, the movement of it, we can't necessarily completely separate from the politics.
So
Yeah.
how did Thomas Cranmer get exposed to those Reformation ideas?
To those Reformation ideas, yeah. If memory serves, I think he might have been in the continent for a little bit of time, but really, but I can't quite remember. But it's really there's this group. I mean, really, what builds that for him is there's these group of people in Cambridge that are having these conversations with one another and talking about these ideas, and so it's really kind of essentially you have this like Cambridge Protestant club that's going on, a little bit beneath the surface, but yeah, so that's really how these ideas start to form there. But I think one of the interesting things that we'll touch on a little bit, England's always been interesting. Church of England's always been interesting because there's always been kind of this divide with, and we see it later with the Puritans and the folks who are called Laudians by some, Catholics would be the term, or Anglo-Catholics as we would say in the States.
How about the Huguenots? They were destroyed in France.
Yeah.
Erased.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to bring Protestantism to France, and the
Right.
church is so powerful there.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Very good. So it's probably.
So Henry wasn't actually the Protestant reformer.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah, as we're talking about this. Yeah. So Henry VIII, right, would not be a Protestant reformer because he didn't care about the Reformation. He didn't care about those ideas. I mean, again, he got his title of Defender of the Faith for writing against Martin Luther. For Henry VIII, it was the power. And I don't, when I say that, I don't mean like completely just purely political. Because for Henry, like he really did believe that he was elected, like that was chosen by God to be the head of the church. Like that was his right as king. That he could say, I want to do what I want, as far as church matters go. So yeah, so that's important to note too. That in spite of his flaws, we are talking about somebody who believed that he had faith, but that faith didn't lead him to the Reformation. It was the people he gave ear to, like Kramner.
We certainly facilitate too by breaking the laws. Even though
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Henry VIII, as we'll see, yes, certainly opens things up to for the Reformation to come in. But again, that's going to be something that's going to be interesting for us to see as we continue down the road, is that this is there's a lot of back and forth about what to do. That Mary's coming back to England is going to have a very significant impact on prayer book history for England and for us as well. So, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all. And like I said, next week we're going to cover, we're probably going to just cover some of the structure for the Eucharist. And then we'll go into these first two prayer books under Kramner and under Edward VI after. So thank you all.